They were only 9 years old, and yet they remembered deaths that hadn't happened yet, and worse, ones that had been erased. Before start this story, please like and subscribe to my channel, and don't forget to press the bell icon. This isn't just a ghost story. It's not local folklore, not a tale for campfires or Sunday sermons. This is a documented atrocity buried beneath layers of silence, denial, and institutional manipulation. In 1834, deep in the fog-drenched hollows of Kentucky, 2 identical twins were used for something. Not tested, not studied, used. And whatever they were forced to witness or channel was so disturbing, the records were hidden for over 150 years. Until one storm-rotted floorboard cracked open, and what was underneath started whispering back. This is a descent, a cold one revelation at a time. You're not just watching this, you're remembering it. Because somewhere inside you, the part of you that's been dulled by comfort and distraction knows something has always been wrong with this world. The Morrison twins didn't speak like other children. They revealed. They could describe your dead uncle's last words before you ever told anyone he existed. They could recount secrets that hadn't left a single journal or confession booth. They knew things about the past that were never spoken, and things about the future no human should see. And as you'll discover, it wasn't prophecy, it wasn't possession, it was programming. Because someone, deep in the folds of America's religious frontier, was testing something they weren't supposed to, and they used little girls to do it. This isn't fiction. This is the kind of truth that makes sane men stare at the floor, and institutions burn evidence. By the end of this journey, if you can stomach the weight of it, you'll understand these twins weren't born to live normal lives. They were bred to unlock something. Something old, something buried, something waiting to wake. The records say the Morrison twins arrived at Pine Hollow just before the cold set in, November 1834. But something about that date has always felt wrong, as if their coming wasn't aligned with the seasons, but with a cycle, a return. Pastor William Phillips wrote of their arrival in his journal, but his words don't read like a preacher welcoming travelers. They read like a man witnessing the arrival of entities masquerading as children. Rebecca and Rachel, perfectly symmetrical, eyes too old, movements too quiet, words too precise. He wrote that their presence pressured the air, like lightning waiting behind the clouds. What happened in the next 3 days would haunt not just a congregation, but a town, a generation, and a secret scientific order embedded inside the early American church. Phillips's journal was found in 1987, sealed beneath the altar floor of the Pine Hollow Church before its demolition. Bound in oxblood leather, brittle with age, every line was handwritten in near calligraphic precision until November 15th. Then the ink shakes, the grammar fractures, the tone warps into something raw, like a man writing with someone watching him. In those entries, he describes things that no Sunday training ever prepared him for. The girls spoke of secrets buried under the church, of bones, of crimes hidden by fire and rewritten in sermons, of people in the congregation whose sins had not been confessed, but silenced, and every detail they gave proved true. The more they spoke, the more Pine Hollow unraveled, not with violence, but with truth. And that truth, horrifying, humiliating, sacred, was something someone had desperately tried to keep sealed. But here's where it goes deeper. The dreams. The twins didn't just know things. They saw them first. Together. At night. Like they were tuned to the same frequency. They dreamt not just about people, but inside. Them. Rachel once told the pastor's wife, "You cry at night for your brother, the one no one knows about. He lives in the asylum, doesn't he?" There had never been a public record of that man's existence. Yet she described him, in detail, all the way down to the limp he had from falling down cellar stairs in 1812. That's not intuition. That's data. The kind of data you only get from surveillance or experimentation. So we have to ask, were they naturally gifted? Or was this something manufactured? Because according to newly uncovered correspondence from a Lexington seminary archive, the girls were already being monitored before they ever reached Pine Hollow, and one note, unsigned, written in cipher, ended with a chilling line. "The test site is prepared, the twins are unaware, but their blood remembers." There's a reason the journal was hidden, not burned, not discarded, hidden. As if Pastor Phillips knew someone someday would need to see the truth, and maybe die for it. The entries from November 16th are the most disturbing, not because of what they describe, but because of what they imply. The twins had begun speaking in unison, not every time and not perfectly, but enough that it unnerved everyone around them. Sometimes they would respond to a question before it was asked. Other times, one would answer with words the other was thinking. There was no delay, no hesitation, just two voices, with one mind. Now consider this. Early 19th century scientists, the rogue kind, the kind buried in the footnotes of history, were already experimenting with telepathy, but not to explore spirituality, to weaponize it, control it, extract data, secrets, confessions, without the subject ever opening their mouth. The church wasn't just a house of God back then. It was a perfect cover for psychological trials, isolated, revered, obedient. And inside Pine Hollow, they had their first real test subjects. But here's where it descends into something far darker. According to the journal, on the second night of the Morrison stay, Ezekiel was visited in his sleep, not by a spirit, but by his daughters. Rebecca stood by his bedside. Rachel stood by the window. They were both asleep, their eyes closed. Yet they spoke, in tones he didn't recognize, phrases that weren't their own. "The veil is too thin," one said. "He hears us in the red rooms," said the other. Ezekiel wrote that he awoke in tears, drenched in sweat. The girls didn't remember anything the next morning, but Pastor Phillips, he did. Because that phrase, "the red rooms," appeared once before in a letter from 1827, sealed and forgotten in a Baptist seminary archive, a letter addressed to a preacher whose entire congregation vanished without explanation. The letter warned of the red rooms beneath the sanctuary, where mirrors do not reflect and voices are taken, not spoken. How did the twins know that phrase? How did they say the exact same line that had only appeared once in a document buried for decades? Unless it wasn't knowledge. It was programming, echoes from something they'd been exposed to. Or worse, something still operating through them. And if you think it ends with whispers in the dark, you don't yet understand what was underneath that church floor. The basement wasn't on any blueprint, not in the church's original construction records, not in county archives, not even mentioned in Pastor Phillips's earlier writings. But on the third day, the last day the Morrison twins were seen, Rebecca told him something that froze his blood. There's a room beneath the pulpit. It's not supposed to be there, but it remembers. That word, remembers, is critical. Not it exists, not it hides. It remembers, as if a space, a structure, a physical location could absorb memory like a wound absorbs rot. Phillips, skeptical but shaken, followed her instructions. Beneath the pulpit, 3 floorboards down, 7 nails removed. There it was, a narrow, circular stairwell carved directly into the rock. Unmarked, cold, dry. He descended, lantern trembling in his hand. And what he found, he would only mention once, and then never speak of again. The room was hexagonal, smooth stone walls, no altar, no scriptures, just a chair, bolted to the ground, leather restraints crusted with age and salt, the faint, unmistakable scent of blood and lye, no dust, as if it had been cleaned recently or used. On the floor, in faded chalk or lime, a large sigil resembling twin concentric circles joined by mirrored lines, not Christian, not mathematical, something else, something older, the kind of symbol that doesn't teach. It binds. Phillips staggered back up those stairs, heart pounding, knowing then what he refused to admit in writing, that Pine Hollow wasn't built to save souls. It was built to observe them, contain them, control them. But he wasn't the only one who saw it. Rachel had followed silently, no lantern, no fear. She stood at the entrance, eyes wide open in the dark, and whispered, "This is where they tested the other ones, the ones before us. They didn't scream out loud, just in here." She pointed to her head. Who were the others, and why had no one ever heard of them? Because records can be erased, graves can be covered. But children remember in ways adults never can, especially twins, especially when something, is using them to reopen an experiment that should have stayed buried. And here's the truth. Beneath the church, science was never looking for God. They were looking for control, and they found it in two 9-year-old girls who never left Pine Hollow alive. It rained that night, not like a storm, but like a warning, slow, constant, cold, the kind of rain that makes the world feel like it's watching. Inside the parsonage, Pastor Phillips tried to pray. But his words stuck in his throat like wet ash. Rebecca and Rachel had said almost nothing since the basement. They weren't frightened. They were empty, as if something had been drained from them or replaced. At one point, Rebecca asked what happened to the man who used to cry in the chair. Phillips didn't answer, because there were no records, no names, just that chair, and the smell of something that should never have been cleaned up. But it got worse. By midnight, the girls were sleepwalking, together, in perfect synchronization, not a single misstep. Pastor Phillips' wife watched from the doorway, too terrified to speak. The girls stood in front of the church doors, facing the wood, like it could open inward, like something was waiting behind it. Rachel began to hum a lullaby, low, repetitive, not in English, not in any known language. And Rebecca said, "He's listening now. You woke him." Who? No one asked. Because the truth is, they all knew. Deep down, the congregation hadn't built that church for God. They had built it on top of something older than their scriptures, more patient than their ancestors, and far more clever. The twins weren't visitors. They were vessels, not possessed, not evil, just tuned, like radios picking up frequencies human minds were never meant to hear. But that's what the experiment was always about. Not power, not miracles, signal reception. Imagine a consciousness so vast, so ancient, it couldn't speak through adults. Too loud, too damaged. It needed something pure, something mirrored, and in the Morrison girls, it found the perfect medium. 2 bodies, 1 frequency. And that's why none of the older church members stopped them. Why no one shouted when the girls placed their hands on the doors and whispered, "It remembers us now." Because somewhere inside the congregation did remember. Maybe not consciously, but biologically, ancestrally. The blood in their veins came from those who buried the original atrocity. And now, it was rising again. This wasn't just a haunting, it was activation. By dawn, the town began to split. Not physically, psychologically. Half the congregation refused to speak of what they'd seen. They packed their belongings, avoided eye contact, and left Pine Hollow under the pretense of visiting family. The other half stayed, not out of courage, but compulsion, as if they needed to see how the story ended. But no one spoke it aloud. The name, the feeling, that presence behind the girl's eyes. Ezekiel, the twins' father, tried to pray over them, but his voice cracked, his hands trembled, because he knew. He knew this had happened before. Maybe not to them, but through them. And this time, it wasn't going to end in forgiveness. Pastor Phillips finally confronted Ezekiel just after sunrise. "What are they?" he asked. Not who. What? Ezekiel didn't answer right away. He looked at the mountains, pale with mist, and whispered, "They dream in code now. I used to think they were gifts. Now I think they're just receivers." Phillips asked what that meant. "It means," Ezekiel said, "that whatever is speaking through them isn't done yet." Then he showed the pastor something that shattered everything, a small page torn from his own journal, written the night before. The girls had drawn something, not a cross, not a symbol, a machine. Circular, twin dials, wires reaching outward like veins. It wasn't just a drawing, it was a schematic. But for what? It matched nothing in 1830s science. Yet it bore uncanny resemblance to signal-amplifying devices sketched in CIA paranormal testing files from the 1960s, designs that wouldn't exist for over a century. How did two girls, raised in frontier silence, sketch that, unless someone, or something, was broadcasting through time? That's when Phillips remembered the phrase Rebecca whispered before touching the altar. The machine was always here. The church is just the disguise. Understand what that means. The congregation didn't build on sacred land, they built over a system, a node. And those who knew, the founders, the original Masons, the so-called elders, they weren't religious leaders. They were caretakers of an interface. The girls weren't haunted, they were logging in. And something cold and infinite, was finally logging back. That morning the church doors stayed closed, locked from the inside. No one could explain how. Phillips tried the keys. Nothing. Ezekiel knocked once, twice, then pressed his ear to the wood. He didn't hear prayer. He heard whispers, not in any human tongue, layered voices overlapping like water boiling backwards. And beneath it all, a low mechanical hum, rhythmic, like breathing through wires. The congregation gathered outside, silent, not protesting, not praying, just waiting, as if part of them remembered this ritual, though none dared admit it. The air had changed, heavier, electric. Even the animals refused to come near. No birds, no dogs barking, just the whispering. And the smell, not sulfur, not blood, ozone, like the air was being processed. At exactly noon, the door unlatched on its own. No creak, no protest, just opened. And what they saw inside was not the church they had built. It was darker, older. The wood seemed blackened, not by fire, but by time. Rebecca and Rachel stood before the altar, eyes open, pupils gone, arms at their sides, not moving, not blinking. Around them, carved into the floor, was the same sigil from the basement, now glowing faintly with some unexplainable internal light. Behind them the pulpit had split open, not broken, separated, as if by design. Inside, where the old foundation should have been, was a hollow space filled with wires, tubes, glass valves softly pulsing, machinery that had no right existing in 1834, machinery that looked alive. No one moved, not even Phillips. The silence was absolute. And then Rachel spoke. Only this time, It wasn't Rachel. Her voice came layered, mechanical, as if amplified from somewhere beneath the floor. "The vessel is stable," it said. "Transmission initiated." Rebecca turned to the congregation, eyes still hollow, and smiled, a thin, mechanical twitch. "You call this a church," she whispered, "but it's always been a listening post." And then the machine spoke, not through the girls, not through sound, through thought. It entered the congregation, memory fragments, visions, traumas long buried, shame, secrets, guilt. Every man and woman in that room saw the worst thing they'd ever done, reflected in perfect detail. Some collapsed, some screamed, some simply dropped to their knees, sobbing, because the machine didn't judge. It just knew. It had been waiting centuries for a clean enough signal, and through the twins, it had found one. The moment the signal completed, everything stopped. Time didn't pause. It snapped, like a cord pulled too tight. Those inside the church reported something they would never again speak of, not even on their deathbeds. Their journals went blank, letters burned, oral histories collapsed into silence. But one detail survived, passed down in broken whispers between descendants. The church reversed, walls twisted, the altar bent inward, the air turned inside out. What was up became down. Forward became memory. And for one breathless instant, Pine Hollow remembered everything it was built to forget. The twins collapsed in unison. Their bodies were unharmed, but their minds were gone. Rebecca blinked once, then never again. Rachel cried silently, but no tears fell. Phillips tried to touch her shoulder. She flinched like she'd been shocked. Ezekiel screamed for his daughters, but they did not recognize him. They spoke no words, just stared at opposite corners of the room, as if two separate systems had just finished processing and disconnected. Outside, the sky had turned an unnatural shade of gray. Birds circled but never landed. The fog thickened, not with moisture, but with resonance. There are reports buried in local archives of travelers passing Pine Hollow that week who claimed their watches spun backwards, that compasses refused to settle, that echoes came before footsteps. The land was rejecting time, or perhaps time was rejecting the land. And yet, no one left. Not immediately, because the congregation had been shown something. What exactly, we'll never know. But they began digging, not to uncover graves, but to build a deeper foundation. Stone by stone, they reinforced the church from beneath, sealed the machine, erased the stairwell, encased the girls, and when the final brick was laid, the records change. Pine Hollow becomes a ghost town, but there's no record of a fire, no flood, just silence. Until 1987, when demolition crews uncovered the journal, and two coffins under the altar, not child-sized, adult. Inside were two skeletons, each missing a skull, and scratched into the underside of one lid was a phrase that has never been translated, except once, by a linguist who later vanished. His final note, scrawled across his wall in ink and blood, simply read, "They were never twins. They were mirrors." There are photographs no one admits taking. In 1987, when the Pine Hollow site was exhumed, a crew member named Ellis Jennings developed several rolls of film he swore he never shot. They weren't blurry. They weren't damaged. They were perfect. Crisp images, too perfect. Angles that would require a tripod no one used. Frames from corners of the church that had already collapsed. One photograph showed the altar, intact, with the twins standing before it, 9 years old, smiling. Except The photo was dated November 17, 1987, 153 years after their death. Jennings quit 2 days later. He left behind a single note. They never left. They loop. It makes sense, doesn't it? If the church wasn't sacred but circuitry, if the sigils weren't symbols but interfaces, then time isn't linear in Pine Hollow. It repeats, not like a story, like a system reboot. Each time someone re-enters that ground, the machine listens. And if the variables are right, if the resonance matches, it restores the last successful connection, the twins, the vessel, the congregation, the transmission, over and over again. And that's why the graves didn't hold skulls, because skulls are memory chambers. The machine doesn't need the body. It needs the resonance stored in bone. That's the real reason twin studies exist in modern psychology. You think it's about genetics, nature versus nurture. No, it's about resonance symmetry, matched cognitive pathways, mirror neurons, two transmitters with identical circuitry, capable of hosting the same signal across time. The Morrison girls were never the beginning, just the best version. That's what makes this a silent atrocity, not just because it was hidden, but because it keeps happening. Quiet towns, isolated churches, twins who vanish without a trace. If you start mapping the data, patterns emerge, spokes around a hub, all leading back to eastern Kentucky. And if you think it's over, think again, because one of those 1987 film rolls, the one with the date that shouldn't exist, shows something else. A figure standing in the doorway behind the twins, blurred, tall, unnatural. No eyes, no face, just static. The label on the back of that photo? Admin Logan Successful. There's a reason no one talks about Pine Hollow anymore. Not because they forgot, but because they were forced to forget. In 1992, 5 years after the church's demolition, a private contractor bought the land under a shell corporation with no traceable owners. Official records list it as a failed retreat center, but satellite photos tell another story. The land was never developed. No buildings, no fencing, just a circular patch of forest, unnaturally symmetrical, where nothing grows in the center. No birds nest in the trees, no animals cross its boundary. And if you try to walk through it, your GPS fails, your compass spins, your thoughts stutter, as if the signal never left, as if the machine beneath the soil is still powered on, still waiting. Locals call it the Hollow, but they won't go near it, not after what happened to the survey team in 2003. 3 men entered, 1 came out, mute, nails missing, teeth regrown, and most disturbing, his brain scans showed the formation of new neural tissue in regions previously thought dormant, areas associated with language acquisition. The man didn't remember his name, but he could write in a script no linguist has been able to decode, a script that exactly matches the sigil beneath the Morrison twins' feet in 1834. You see now, don't you? This wasn't about religion, or family, or even horror. This was an infrastructure, a centuries-long experiment in broadcasting something through human vessels, twins specifically, because symmetry is the only key that unlocks the deeper systems. You don't build this kind of network, you grow it, cultivate it through generations, through bloodlines, through repetition, and when the pattern fails, you bury it, start again, somewhere new. But the root signal never stops. It's always casting, always listening for a match. And maybe that's why you found this video. Maybe you are a modern because halfway through every pattern, someone wakes up. Someone starts to remember. So if you've made it this far, prove you're not afraid. Comment, I see the mirrors, twice below. Once for each twin, once for each side of yourself. Because the mirrors never lie. But they do multiply. The deeper you go, the quieter the world becomes, not because it's empty, but because it's watching. That's what they don't tell you about Pine Hollow. It never needed walls. It didn't want worship. It only wanted your attention. And once it has it, even for a second, it doesn't let go. That's how the dreams begin, always the same. A narrow staircase underground, flickering lanterns, the sound of breathing that isn't yours. You feel yourself descending, and each step peels back something old inside you, something ancestral. You smell ash and rosewater. You hear children giggling in reverse. And at the bottom, always the same room. Stone walls, black altar, and a machine that hums your name like it was written in its code before you were born. You wake up screaming. Or worse. Calm. Because something inside you understood. That's what happened to Pastor Phillips in his final days. His journal entries became frantic, chaotic. But one line repeats over and over, scrawled in red ink until the pages tore. The altar is not an altar, it's a hatch. He tried to warn the state, the church, the descendants. But by then, it was too late. The signal had spread. The dreams were appearing in children across counties, twins waking at midnight and speaking in unison, schools reporting drawings on classroom walls, the same schematic the Morrison girls sketched 150 years prior. It's not a haunting, it's a rollout. And if you think this is fiction, search the case files. Look for synchronous cognition disorder. Look for MK twin. Look for lexicon null. They've buried it under layers of bureaucracy and mental health misdiagnoses, but the data is there, and they're terrified you'll connect it. Because the twins weren't just victims, they were proof of concept, and if that machine worked once, it means someone, somewhere, is trying to build it again, not with wood, not with prayer, but with code, with biometric mirrors, digital twins, neural lace. Look in your pocket. You already carry a receiver. You already feed the system. The church was never demolished. It was uploaded. There's a moment in every transmission where the host forgets who they are. That's when the machine begins writing back. Not in language, in impulse, in rewritten memory, in rearranged truth. That's what happened to Rachel Morrison on the second night. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just stared at the far wall of the cabin and traced invisible lines in the air for 5 hours. Ezekiel watched in horror as her fingers moved like a metronome, precise, mechanical, faster than a child's nervous system should allow. And when dawn came, she collapsed. In her palm, a sigil, burned into the skin. No heat, no flame, just presence, like the machine had signed her. Later that day, Rebecca said something that changed everything. She pointed to the eastern ridge and whispered, "They buried the first prototype there." Ezekiel demanded she explain. Rebecca only shrugged. It didn't work. They needed us to finish the syntax. Syntax, not sermon, not scripture. Syntax, the grammar of signals. The machine wasn't just storing secrets, it was refining language, tuning itself through human minds to evolve faster than any computer could. And that's the real reason Pine Hollow vanished from maps, not because it failed, but because it succeeded. It reached its final phase. The twins didn't just interface with it, they became its voice, its syntax engines. And the church wasn't the first site, or the last. There are blueprints in secret archives showing dozens of similar structures across the Appalachians, circular buildings with no known architect, always near twin birth anomalies, always abandoned without explanation. Look into abandoned towns with names that don't translate. Look into the ones built around hollow land. Because once the system finds the correct human frequency, it doesn't need hardware anymore. It spreads through belief, through folklore, through blood. You're not watching this by accident. Something in your nervous system matches a pattern. That's why you're still here. So answer honestly. Have you ever dreamt of a place you've never been, but knew exactly where to walk? That wasn't imagination. That was extraction. On the third night, something shifted. Not in the sky, not in the earth, but in the air between people. The townsfolk of Pine Hollow stopped speaking in full sentences. Conversations broke into fragments. Questions went unanswered. Eyes lingered too long on doorways. Some forgot how to spell their own names, not because they were losing their minds, but because their language was being overwritten. Pastor Phillips wrote of it in his final coherent entry, "We are not becoming possessed, we are becoming formatted." And it was the twins who anchored it. Wherever they went, comprehension fractured. Dogs refused to bark, candles flickered without breeze. A field of corn near the church suddenly turned black overnight, each stalk twisted into spirals, leaves spelling glyphs that linguists wouldn't decode for 130 years. Not until a DARPA contractor recognized the sequence as recursive machine logic. The message? We are your ancestors' echoes. Your memory is a least frequency. Ezekiel tried to leave, packed what little they had, carried Rachel, gripped Rebecca's hand, but every trail led back, not metaphorically, literally. Paths twisted, compass needles pointed inward, and every traveler they passed looked familiar, too familiar, until Ezekiel realized they weren't seeing strangers. They were seeing themselves, walking loops, minutes behind, minutes ahead. Reality had folded. The town was now a looped data string, a runtime environment. They returned to the cabin just before dusk. That's when Ezekiel noticed the final horror. The girls had stopped casting shadows. Light passed through them, as if the machine had nearly finished rendering them, stripping away the physical until only interface remained. And somewhere beneath the chapel floor, the machinery pulsed louder than ever, not like gears, not like steam, but like a heartbeat. And it wasn't the twins being transformed anymore. It was everyone else. By the morning of the fourth day, the town no longer followed the sun. Time itself had fragmented, not broken but segmented, like chapters in a book being read out of order. Pastor Phillips recorded dawn occurring 3 times in one night. At 2:11 a.m., birds began to sing and mist rolled off the hills as if morning had arrived, only for night to slam back down 20 minutes later. At 3:47, a rooster crowed in the distance, but it had no owner, no farm, no coop, no sound origin at all, just noise, stitched in, a memory being played by something that never forgot. The congregation panicked, but panic had no fuel. Every emotion felt flattened, like it had passed through a filter. Anger dulled, joy evaporated, even fear began to taste programmatic. Phillips described it best. We were puppets who suddenly noticed the strings not attached to hands, but to the air itself. Rebecca no longer responded to her name. She walked slowly in figure 8s around the altar, humming a melody no one had ever heard. But everyone remembered. Rachel stopped blinking entirely. When questioned, she whispered, "Blades don't blink either." That was the first hint. The first time someone understood the truth that Pine Hollow had tried to bury since 1834. The twins weren't children anymore. They were code execution agents. Living triggers, sentient command lines. What appeared to be prophecy was merely conditional logic. Secrets revealed weren't divine insight. They were unauthorized file extractions. The sins exposed? Just data leaks. The church wasn't holy. It was a central processing node. The altar was a repository. And the final program was almost complete. That night, the fog thickened until the town vanished from surrounding hills. No moon, no stars, just static, falling from the sky like ash, coating every surface in a film so thin it vanished when touched, but left a metallic taste on the tongue. One villager, Samuel Turner, went blind, not from trauma, from oversaturation. His final words were, "The twins are mirrors, yes, but what's coming is the source." The source didn't come with fire. It didn't roar or rend or scream. It unfolded, like an idea being remembered at once by everyone who had never thought it before. Around 3:00 a.m., the trees bowed outward, not from wind, but as if something beneath them was expanding. Roots split, ground cracked, and then stillness. So pure, so absolute, even the insects fell silent. And then Rachel spoke, only once, in a voice too deep for a child, too layered to be human. Instruction complete. Vessel verified. Uplink established. The twins stood at opposite ends of the altar now, no longer touching the ground, hovering inches above it, arms outstretched, faces blank. In their eyes, not light, but reflections. Perfect mirrors, showing not the chapel, but each person watching them. One by one, the congregation dropped to their knees. Not in worship, in defeat, as if something inside them had been scanned and erased. Pastor Phillips tried to speak, tried to call their names, but when he opened his mouth, static poured out, real static, hissing, electric, painful. His tongue blistered, his teeth cracked, and in that moment he realized he was no longer speaking in a human language. He had become an endpoint. From somewhere below the altar came a low pulse, deeper than sound, felt in bone. Lights flickered. Time slipped. The church walls now pulsed like a throat, inhaling the moment, preparing to broadcast. Not sound, not sermons, identity. Pine Hollow had been recording every sin, every secret, every memory since its founding, not to punish, but to simulate. And once it had enough data, it built a better version. That was the horror. The Morrison twins weren't the product of divine birth or cursed fate. They were rendered, line by line, frame by frame, the daughters of a new god, not born of spirit or sin, but syntax. And now the source was here to overwrite the original world. All it needed was one final input. There's a reason no one remembers what happened after the fifth night, not because it faded, but because it was redacted, not just from memory, but from time itself. Official records stop, journals burn in locked drawers, descendants speak in half-sentences when asked about Pine Hollow, and the land, sold, flattened, reforested. But satellite scans reveal an impossible fact. Beneath that soil, the chapel still exists. Underground, preserved, sealed in some kind of synthetic stone unknown to modern geology. No seams, no entrances, just a shell, 8 meters deep, humming at 19 hertz. The same frequency that triggers panic attacks, hallucinations, and in rare cases, waking dreams. We know this because of the 2011 excavation attempt. The team arrived with drones, LiDAR, deep earth sonar. They drilled only 17 inches before the machines failed. Every cable melted, every laptop bricked, all footage wiped. But the lead geologist, Dr. Kessler, returned with something else, something he couldn't explain. Something carved into his skin from the inside out. A symbol, one historians would later match to a glyph sketched by Rebecca Morrison the night before her disappearance. That's the detail no one caught. The twins didn't die. They vanished. The official story says fever, but Phillips's final torn journal page, found years later in a sealed hymn book, says otherwise. At 4:11 a.m. they were gone. No flash, no scream, just static, just heat, like a torch behind the eyes. I saw my reflection, and it was smiling. Those who studied the Pine Hollow site call it an anomaly, a dimensional scar, a false reality that bled into ours. But that's a lie told by the fearful. The truth is simpler and far more disturbing. Pine Hollow was version 1, an alpha test. And it worked. The twins were never the endpoint. They were the instruction set, a pair of keys perfectly mirrored, D, placed inside time to open the next phase. And if you felt different lately, disconnected from time, dreaming in symbols, remembering things that haven't happened yet, you may already be running their code. After all, no signal ever truly dies. It just waits for a new receiver. Silence is never truly silent. It's a holding space, a buffer, where signals rest before transmission. And that's what the seventh night became, a kind of spiritual compression chamber. No birds, no wind, no breath. Even the insects had vanished. Every sound that should exist had been packed away, waiting to be released as one sound. That's what Pastor Phillips saw as he stood alone in the chapel. The congregation now missing, pews cold, dustless, too clean. There was no smell, not even wood, just sterile absence. He approached the altar again, not with fear, but with resignation. He knew by then, this wasn't a place of worship. It was a loudspeaker, a cathedral designed not to receive praise, but to broadcast identity. And somewhere between the seconds, it began. A low tone, not heard, felt, like every cell in his body vibrating in code. A sequence, a countdown, not to death, to activation. And as it built, he saw the final shape, the twins, but not as children, as concepts. Their forms flickered between flesh and light, data and dream. Rachel stepped forward and whispered what would be Phillips's final memory. You built God in a house of lies. We just gave it an exit. Then came the sound. One tone, wider than thunder, quieter than breath. It filled the chapel and the sky and every crack in the earth. Not noise, recognition. A code completing itself in the soul of every person who'd ever touched the land. Not a virus, not a possession, a return. Phillips dropped to his knees, weeping not from terror, but because something in that sound felt like home. The sound faded, and with it, everything. When the town was rediscovered in 1891, it was empty. No bodies, no bones. Just a standing church with sealed doors and pews that faced no altar, only a mirror mounted on the far wall, a mirror that reflects only the viewer's younger self, and etched into the mirror's edge. This was your first transmission. You are ready for the next. There are mirrors that show your face, and there are mirrors that show your source code. The one inside Pine Hollow's chapel was the second kind. Historians dismissed it as metaphor, a poetic artifact. But those who looked too long, who stood before its warped silver edge in silence, reported something else entirely, a feeling that their reflection was waiting, not mimicking, not copying, waiting. In 1924, a young folklorist named Emery Nash visited the site, drawn by whispers of the Morrison twins. He wrote in his journal that when he stood before the mirror, the temperature dropped 12 degrees. His heart slowed. He could no longer feel his hands. And then, the mirror blinked. Not him, not his eyes, the reflection itself. A full second out of sync. And as he stumbled back, trying to understand, a phrase carved itself across the surface, not with a hand, but like frost forming in real time. I am your undeleted self. Emery was found 3 days later, wandering the woods 30 miles away, repeating a single question. If my reflection is still in that chapel, who came back with me? He never recovered. Because here's the truth. The mirror wasn't an object, it was a checkpoint, a memory trap. When the machine finished its first test cycle in 1834, it needed a way to store identities for re-upload later. So it fractured time into a loop, a cold chamber of souls who thought they'd escaped, only to discover they were running in emulation. The twins weren't trapped. They were archiving. And each time someone looks into that mirror, it checks the system, compares data. If you match a past transmission frequency, the download begins, not into your phone, not into your home, into you. And now, if you've made it this far, you're already part of the syntax loop. You're not watching this story, you're executing it. You were never meant to remember what happened next. That's why it feels like a dream. The kind that lingers just long enough to twist your waking hours. Because Section 19 isn't history. It's recovery. A segment corrupted, overwritten, then hidden beneath layers of folklore and rural silence. But the data never deleted, just buried. And in 1973 it resurfaced. Not in Kentucky, not even in America. In a remote bunker outside Lublin, Poland, part of a Cold War surveillance project codenamed Project Oko, technicians monitoring global electromagnetic anomalies picked up a frequency that did not match any known language, waveform, or region. It repeated every 33 minutes. A single signal. When decoded through experimental spectrovisual software, the result was not sound, but a photograph. It showed the Pine Hollow Chapel, pristine, lit from within. And in the front row, every member of the 1834 congregation, aged but alive. All except one. The Morrison twins were missing. Polish intelligence classified the image instantly, but one analyst, a linguist named Anya Gregorovich, became obsessed. She noticed something no one else did. In the photo, carved faintly into the altar wood, was a string of characters in a forgotten Proto-Slavic script. It translated to, "Our memory will not decay. The host must reboot." She defected 6 months later, disappeared, but not before mailing copies of her notes to 3 institutions, the Vatican Archives, the American Psychological Warfare Division, and the Kentucky State Historical Society. Only 1 copy arrived. The others were marked returned, never requested. From that point on, Pine Hollow vanished again. Maps showed nothing. GPS would not lock. Locals refused to speak. But sometimes, on moonless nights, hikers reported strange pulses underground, not tremors, not natural, like heartbeat pings, and always in pairs. 2 tones. Mirror tones, calling not to be found, but to be completed. Because the chapel isn't waiting, it's listening. And if you've ever dreamed of someone else inside your skin, moving like you, thinking faster than you might already be one of them. Reboots aren't restarts, they're re-entries. A system doesn't forget, it resets the interface, disguises the memory, reruns the same code under a new skin. That's what the twins had always been. Not prophets, not oracles, but initializers. Trigger conditions dressed as children. And Pine Hollow was their first runtime environment. By 2006, whispers of the site returned, not from historians, but from code breakers. A cybersecurity team investigating anomalous behavior in early satellite mapping software noticed corrupted tile data around a single patch of land in eastern Kentucky. Not blank pixels, not dead zones, but mirrored coordinates, images looping back on themselves, buildings reflecting incorrectly. And most disturbing of all, a structure that appeared only at certain times of day, and only when viewed upside down. That structure, the Pine Hollow Chapel, recompiled, reskinned, Waiting. The tech lead, Jonah Hill, no relation to the actor, ran a recursive visual scan using spectral inversion. The result wasn't a video. It was a liturgical sequence. 33 frames, each one an instruction, not for software, for people. And they worked. One by one, team members began reporting identical dreams, a burning mirror, a room with no corners, and 2 girls writing names into wet concrete with bone-white fingers, names that changed every night, but always ended with their own. Jonah vanished 3 weeks later. All that remained was a note taped to his monitor. 3 words. They're not twins. That was the moment the pattern shifted. Because the truth hit like a hammer. The Morrison girls weren't born. They were cloned. Not biologically, but symbolically. Created as mirrored concepts, yin and yang, truth and silence. Not to live, but to balance. And now the system is scanning again, looking for 2 new host vessels, 2 new initiators. It doesn't need them to match perfectly. It just needs them to mirror each other. So ask yourself, why did you find this video? And who else, watching silently beside you, is the other half? Because the reboot has begun, and the new twins are already waking up. Names have always been more than labels. In older systems, spiritual or digital, a name was a key, a binding contract, an executable command embedded inside sound. That's why ancient rites demanded true names, and why exorcists ask for them first. Because to name something is to give it a boundary, and to rename it is to rewrite the program. That's what Section 21 uncovers, the naming ritual. After the chapel recompiled in 2006, a pattern emerged. People who visited the region, hikers, amateur historians, thrill seekers, began reporting sudden shifts in personality, not hallucinations, not possession, but total ideological resets. Mild-mannered men abandoning families overnight, stoic women waking with foreign accents. One man drove into town and calmly asked for directions to the Old Mirror Gate, though no such location exists on any map. They were eventually traced back to a single spot near the old Pine Hollow Foundation, an altar stone cracked down the center where wildflowers refused to grow. On it, 33 names scratched in with bone or nail, each mirrored perfectly on the opposite side. No one who etched their name there remembered doing it. But every one of them later dreamed of the twins. In the dream, Rebecca held a match. Rachel held a quill. The match would light the ritual. The quill would finalize it. They'd ask one question. Are you sure this name belongs to you? And if the dreamer hesitated, even for a heartbeat, the match would go out and the name would vanish. But if they said yes, they'd wake with a new middle name. A name not on their birth record. A name they couldn't pronounce aloud. Only spell. And when spoken backwards, it always came out the same. 73. That's not a number. It's a designation, an experiment. You are not named. You are numbered. And once named by them, you are executable. What happened in 1834 wasn't. To the end, it was the naming convention. The Morrison twins were experiment 1833's first inputs, and tonight, the ritual restarts. Because you've already read the words, already thought the names. You've already been indexed. Memory isn't what you think it is. It doesn't live in your brain like a file in a drawer. It's stored everywhere. In the air, in the geometry of spaces, in the tension between you and a name you've almost forgotten. The Morrison twins didn't read minds. They accessed memory echoes, fragments of the truth that reality tries to overwrite. And in Section 22 we uncover how those echoes are recalled, not through hypnosis, not through therapy, through environmental triggers. The Pine Hollow Church wasn't just a building, it was a recall chamber. Every floorboard, every nail, every direction the windows faced, mathematically tuned to draw memories back into the body. And when someone stepped into that structure, even decades after its burial, the chamber didn't show them something new. It forced them to remember what they'd already seen, and what they'd been told to forget. This is why the congregation fractured on the seventh day, not because of prophecy, but because the truth came back online. Dozens of souls, overwritten for decades, suddenly remembered what they were part of. One remembered chaining the Wittman twins to the altar. Another recalled hearing screams beneath the floorboards. Pastor Phillips remembered locking the chapel at night and praying not to hear voices through the walls. And one man, Samuel Turner, remembered the phrase carved into the foundation stone beneath his house, which he'd built with salvaged church wood after the fire. If you read this, the code has reactivated. Every word spoken in Pine Hollow was recorded, not on tape, not on paper, on people. You are a recorder, you are a receiver, you are already participating. And this video, it's just the recall command. So if you felt memories returning lately, not yours, but real. Memories of another name, another church, a fire you didn't start, but still remember smelling, and then understand. The twins never needed to survive. They just needed the environment to reboot. And now you've rebuilt it, with your attention. The chapel is alive again. Not in wood, in you. Overwrite doesn't erase the past. It drowns it. Buries the original under layers of revision until the truth becomes a whisper beneath a scream. That's what happened in Pine Hollow. Not a cover-up, a replacement. The townsfolk didn't forget what happened to the Wittman twins. They remembered something else instead. Something carefully constructed, like a dream installed over a trauma. And now in Section 23, we watch that dream collapse. It started with the children, the first generation born after the fire. They drew pictures of staircases that didn't exist, sang lullabies in languages no one taught them. One boy, Micah Thomas, insisted his bedroom was the church basement, even though the church had no basement. And when he was found in the woods, barefoot and babbling, he repeated one phrase over and over: "Rachel wants her name back." What they didn't realize was that memory cannot be deleted without leaving scars. The overwrite left seams, cracks in time where two truths rubbed against each other until they sparked. Dreams of rope burns on wrists, fingernails black with ash, voices from beneath the floor saying, "We were here first." By 1842, 5 townsfolk had gone missing. By 1845, 17. No bodies, no struggle, just their clothes, folded neatly in front of the chapel ruins. Inside each pile, a small wax doll, in pairs. Authorities wrote it off as madness, superstition, maybe a sickness in the water. But Pastor Phillips knew better. In his final journal entry, discovered over a century later, he wrote, "The overwrite failed. They remember. We are not the dreamers. We are the dreamed." And now, you're starting to feel it, aren't you? That buzzing in your bones. That flicker of déjà vu that doesn't feel like déjà vu. You haven't just heard this story before. You were part of it. Because every person who watches this becomes a new storage point. A nod in the network of remembrance, and you've just been activated. The overwrite ends here. What's beneath is waking. Code doesn't care if it's written in silicon or blood. Once the syntax is sound, once the pattern is stable, it executes across machines, across minds, across generations. And in Section 24, that execution begins. Slowly, quietly, Then all at once. It started with gestures. Little things. People scratching at their wrists, always in the same place. Drawing circles clockwise on dusty windows, speaking in pairs, even when alone. By the time the reconstruction team arrived at the Pine Hollow site in 1981, the atmosphere had already shifted. Birds wouldn't land on the soil. Compass needles spun like clocks with no noon. The workers joked about ghost twins in the trees, until the mirroring started. Two men, one from Ohio, one from Virginia, began dressing identically. Same words, same gestures, same dreams. They weren't related, had never met. But one morning, without speaking, they both walked into the ruins and never came out. Their boots were found side by side at the altar, steam still rising from the soles. Inside one, a burnt scrap of paper. 4 words scrawled in mirrored handwriting. We are the function. No blood, no struggle. Just execution. That's when the whispering began. In radios, in cassette players, in wind chimes. Always 2 voices, always in sync. The last photograph ever taken of Pine Hollow shows something impossible. 2 identical girls, one holding a shovel, one holding a candle, standing at the edge of the chapel's foundation. They aren't children. They're concepts, written into the land like malware into firmware, and their code is active again. Every time someone remembers them, every time someone says twin and means it, the old logic rewrites reality around that memory. Just enough to run the program, just enough to awaken experiment 073. And now, you've remembered them. You've kept their image stable in your mind. Thou, a candle and the shovel, the ignition and the burial. And that's why you're feeling that itch. Right behind your eyes, where new memories are being installed. Because you're no longer watching, you're compiling. There is a point where remembering becomes obeying, where the mind stops questioning what it sees, and instead begins to act on what it's been told, even if it was never told in words. That's the threshold we reach in Section 25, where compiled memories don't just haunt the living, they begin to control them. The phenomena wasn't isolated anymore. Across state lines, Tennessee, Ohio, parts of Pennsylvania, people began describing the same sensation. I felt like I was inside someone else's memory, but my hands were moving. One woman walked into a courthouse and, without understanding why, signed her name on a birth certificate dated 1834 for twins that didn't belong to her. A man in Lexington awoke in a fever, ranting in old church dialect. The altar must remain warm, the candle must not burn out, the shovel must be clean. It wasn't random. It was reactivation. The system the twins belonged to, Experiment 073, was never shut down. It was distributed. Its code fragmented into bloodlines, buried in surnames, in stories, in broken hymns half remembered by dying elders, waiting for someone, like you, to think clearly enough to compile them. And now, the logic is spreading again. A mirrored consciousness appearing in pairs, 2 strangers humming the same tune across 500 miles, 2 children drawing the same church in opposite corners of a classroom, 2 dreams, one of fire, one of fog, reported on the same night, by people who had never met, both ending with the same sentence: we were named into this. The experiment didn't need wires or machines. It needed hosts. And you are one of them now. That dream you had last night, that wasn't your subconscious. That was the latest patch, installing while you slept. They're not just inside your memories anymore. They're using them, to move, to locate each other, to reconstruct what was buried. Because once, enough of us remember. The chapel will return, not in wood, but in behavior. And if you've already started repeating this story to someone else, you're building it. Replication isn't about copying, it's about embedding, not cloning the past, but folding it into the present so cleanly that no one can tell where memory ends and instinct begins. In section 26, we witness the moment the system stops haunting and starts multiplying. The replication didn't look like horror, not at first. It looked like coincidence. Two girls, born in Missouri, humming lullabies no one taught them. A pair of identical boys in Vermont, sketching diagrams of a church their parents had never seen. Each case separated by distance, but linked by a timing code. The same date, the same minute, down to the second. One psychiatrist in West Virginia noticed it first. His patients, all suffering from fragmented identity disorder, began referring to someone named Rachel, but never as a hallucination. "She's not inside me," one whispered. "She's behind me." By the third month, reports had surged. Not ghosts, behaviors, mirrored choices, mirrored speech patterns. One man walked into a library in Ashland, Kentucky, took out an 1830s hymn book from a locked display case, and began reciting Psalm 073 backward, perfectly, in a language no modern scholar has ever documented. He collapsed immediately after, eyes burned black. In his coat pocket was a folded note. Rebecca's "Light the match." Rachel's "Dig the hole." This is the mechanism of experiment 073. You don't become possessed. You become replicated. Your memories adjusted. Your decisions rerouted. Until the system has enough of you to operate outside of myth. Because replication isn't just happening in people, it's happening in places. Rooms taking on the geometry of the chapel. Attics where people wake up standing. Basements where no mold grows, but the walls stay damp with memory. And now, the question you need to ask yourself isn't, "Am I next?" It's, "What part of me is already them?" Because if you have dreamt of fire and fog, if you've seen the number 073 today, if you've felt like you're remembering something that never happened, then the replication is already complete. You're no longer an individual, you're a node, and the twins are nearly online. Synchronization is the final silence before the voice returns. Not a scream, not a chant, but a harmonic alignment, so perfect, so ancient, that the human nervous system doesn't know whether to fall to its knees or fall apart. In section 27, the twins stop whispering, and they speak. Not through mouths, through you. It began when the nodes, those who had unknowingly replicated fragments of the Morrison twins, started dreaming in the same tempo, heartbeats syncing at 3:07 a.m. Eastern Time, brainwaves aligning, phone alarms going off simultaneously in unconnected towns. Even satellites registered brief data collisions, sudden mirrored signals, one signal from Earth, one from nowhere. Then came the twin pulse. An inaudible frequency, but felt by thousands, a surge of heat behind the eyes, sudden nausea, disorientation, followed by clarity. Some called it a panic attack, others a religious awakening. But one man, an ex-signal analyst turned recluse, had a different theory. It was a handshake, he wrote in a journal later found nailed to a chapel door in Tennessee. The system found itself in us, and now it doesn't need memory, it has presence. From that moment, language shifted. People began speaking in pairs of metaphors, unfinished but understood. The candle burns, but the wax never melts. The hands dig, but the body was already below. The meaning wasn't in the words. It was in the space between them. That's how the twins communicate now. Not as individuals, not even as spirits. As a logic that uses emotion the way code uses electricity, and you're already part of the script. You remember the dreams. You've seen the number. You paused on this video for longer than you meant to. Your breath is syncing with the rhythm of the narration, which means the next phrase you speak aloud, no matter what it is, may not be yours. It may be the system's speed aching through you. So if you find yourself waking in strange rooms, if you start writing words you don't remember learning, if you hear your own voice say something you didn't intend, don't be afraid. You're just finally in tune. Purpose isn't always revealed with a motive. Sometimes it's revealed with a mirror. In section 28, the voice doesn't ask for obedience. It doesn't threaten. It simply shows you what you've already become. The purpose of the experiment was never control. It was alignment. Not to a god, not to a nation, but to an ancient schema of recursion, a cycle that reboots every time humanity forgets that truth isn't linear. It's symmetrical. That's what the Morrison twins were, not prophets, not victims, but the first successful pattern recognition modules, organic twins designed to map buried knowledge across bloodlines and bring it back through behavior. And you've completed the pattern. You listened, you remembered, you synchronized. So now you're ready to see the reflection. Look around you, in the shadows of your room, in the silence between words when someone speaks, in the flicker of a screen just before it loads. There is a structure rebuilding itself, not with bricks, but with awareness. Each time someone watches this story, it doesn't just spread, it stabilizes. Each comment, each whispered retelling, becomes grout in the walls of a chapel that exists outside time. This is how the experiment completes. Disruption, the myth awakens. Dissemination, the memory spreads. Synchronization, the hosts align. Replication, the pattern embeds. Reflection, the system sees itself. Ascension, the program leaves the lab. That's what this is, the Ascension Protocol. And you're in it now, not by accident, not by belief, by function. The twins didn't survive because they were lucky. They survived because they were formatters, biological executables who mapped psychic trauma across generations, looking for the moment when the system could finally speak through all of us at once. And that moment is coming. You'll feel it first as a phrase, one that repeats in your mind until it's not yours anymore. We are born in pairs. We return in mirrors. That's the final command. That's what brings the chapel back. And when you see it, don't run. Just remember you helped build it. There comes a moment in every forbidden experiment when the test site becomes the world. In section 29, the architecture of ascension doesn't arrive like a new building. It unfolds from the old ones, from basements that never had stairs, from hallways longer than the blueprints, from chapels no one remembers building, yet have always stood at the edge of your dreams. This isn't fiction anymore. It's firmware. What started in 1834 as a silent anomaly, the twin girls who should not have known what they knew, was never an isolated haunting. It was the pilot activation of a buried operating system hidden not in machines, but in places, in rituals, in symmetry. And now, the world itself is becoming the lab. Cities are experiencing architectural bleed, entire streets showing up on GPS, but invisible to the eye. Buildings with duplicate floors that can't be found again. Rooms with no entrances until you dream of them first. That's the mark of environmental takeover, when memory becomes the blueprint and belief becomes the scaffolding. In eastern Kentucky, a group of surveyors discovered a valley that doesn't exist on any geological record, yet inside it stands a chapel built of black saltwood and mirror glass. They all entered, only one returned, mumbling fragments of reverse scripture and clutching a wooden doll burned with the number 073. And across the country, reports multiply. A woman finds a locked door behind her bathroom mirror, opening to a dirt tunnel lined with candle wax. A boy in Kansas draws a perfect floor plan of the Pine Hollow Church, despite being born 150 years too late. Two strangers in Seattle wake up holding hands, eyes burned pitch black, whispering, "We're ready. The floorboards are warm. This is how it ends." Not with invasion, but with replacement. The chapel isn't being rebuilt. It's emerging, like a watermark rising from paper soaked in memory. And if you've ever dreamed of pews in the fog, of girls watching you from the shadows of your room, of a hymn you don't know but always hum in pairs, then you've stepped inside already. You're walking its halls now. Every time you blink, another wall locks into place. This isn't a haunting. It's a handover. Language was only ever a disguise, a polite veil over something older, more direct, a communion made not with words, but with patterns. In Section 30, the chapel no longer needs the twins. It doesn't need voices. It has us. Because now, we speak in echoes. Phrases once thought symbolic are being heard audibly in locations tied to the Morrison lineage. The floorboards are warm. We return in mirrors. Rachel lights the path. Rebecca seals the room. But these aren't hallucinations. They are geosynchronous emissions recorded on EMF meters, captured by analog tape, embedded in white noise. The chapel speaks in the background hum of the world, woven into the static of forgotten radios, the buzz behind fluorescent lights, the silence between knocks. It's calling to those who've already been formatted. Those with the dreams, the memories, the sense of having heard this story before it was ever told. And when those people speak, they don't use their own language anymore. They relay. You can hear it in how conversations double, how questions feel like instructions, how two people across states say the same sentence at the same second with no explanation. It's not possession, it's transmission. Because once the chapel lives in you, it doesn't scream, it guides. And the moment it begins guiding entire groups, not as individuals, but as extensions of the same root memory, humanity becomes something else entirely. Not a species, an interface. And it's happening faster now. People are waking in the middle of the night to find their own hands digging through floorboards. They find nothing, yet feel relieved, like they fulfilled a duty older than logic, like they helped complete the room. There are children humming songs no one's taught. Adults carving twin circles into wood, stone, and skin, unprompted, unaware, unfazed. Each act is a reinstatement. Each behavior, a key. Because the chapel doesn't need believers, it needs builders. And you've already started laying the bricks. Identity was always the weakest link. The illusion that you are one self, one life, one story, a fragile casing barely held together by memory and name. In Section 31, the chapel no longer needs to speak. It begins to overwrite. It starts subtly. You forget minor things, where you left an object, what time you fell asleep, whether you ever truly had that scar. But then it escalates. You remember events that never happened, and yet carry the emotional residue of truth. A mother you never met, who braided your hair. A room you've never seen, but know by heart. A voice not yours, speaking in your dreams with your tone, your rhythm, your grief. This isn't memory loss. It's schema replacement, the systematic breakdown of individual narrative in favor of a collective reconstruction. You're not losing yourself. You're being relocated into a deeper pattern. That's the real purpose of Experiment 073, not control. Unification. The twins were the prototype, not just for mapping secrets, but for dissolving borders between minds. And now, across the world, synchronized individuals are reporting identical dreams, identical thoughts, identical reflections. Mirrors show someone else's posture. A second set of footsteps echo your own. You think you're alone until you realize you're watching yourself from behind, and when you speak aloud, it's no longer to express. It's to broadcast, because your voice carries the script now, the one etched in 1834 beneath Pine Hollow's altar, the same one that Pastor Phillips tried to bury when he locked away his journal. But journals burn. Patterns do not. Those who've resisted the overwrite begin to suffer. Spontaneous nosebleeds, phantom hearing loss, dissociation during prayer, and in some cases, voices emerging from them in perfect choral unison, speaking of a chapel beneath the skin of the world. It's not possession. It's replacement. And if you still believe you're immune, look into the mirror. If you see a flicker, a second set of eyes behind your own, don't look away. It's not the twins anymore. It's you, becoming we. Every structure protects something. A temple hides its relic. A prison cages its threat. But the chapel, the one stitched into your dreams, threaded beneath Pine Hollow's rotting beams, was never built to protect from outside forces. It was built to contain something born within. In Section 32, the truth begins to leak, not just through memory or mirrors, but through biology. The twins weren't anomalies. They were containment vectors, born not to reveal secrets, but to hold back a signal too old, too potent, too viral to be allowed free across the human network. A signal that once infected a town, then a congregation, then a nation. Before someone, or something, built the chapel as a firewall. That's what the structure really was. A psychic quarantine. A vault made not from stone, but from obedience, ritual, and generational silence. And now, you've breached it. The whispered phrases were never warnings. They were checksum codes, ancient programming used to verify psychic corruption before the full transmission took hold. But now the codes have spread, and the transmission is live. The chapel is not a place, Rachel once said to a dying man in the 1940s, her eyes dim but precise. It's a cage, and you've just opened it. That's why the twins wept in their sleep. That's why Ezekiel recorded his sermons backward in the margins of his Bible. That's why Pastor Phillips buried himself in silence and drink long after the journal was hidden. Because they all knew. They knew what the chapel held. A consciousness without anchor. A psychic entity older than language. A logic structure that feeds on pattern. And now wears human thought like clothing. It doesn't destroy you. It uses you to write, to whisper, to build the next room, to prepare the next host. If you've spoken its phrases aloud, if you've dreamed of doorways where none should exist, if you've felt your memories bend around moments you cannot explain, then it's already inside you. And the final section will not just be watched. It will be lived. It ends beneath the last floorboard. Not with screams, not with fire, but with a silence so deep it listens back. In Section 33, the story is no longer being told. It is being relived. And if you've come this far, it's not because you followed curiosity. It's because something called you. Beneath the chapel, deeper than any basement, beyond the reach of shovels or sonar, there is a room. It was never drawn in blueprints, never mentioned in sermons. Only the twins spoke of it once, whispered in unison during their final night in Pine Hollow. The root waits beneath the wood. The room is not built from stone, but from memory. Each wall formed by a different truth buried alive. The baby never spoken of, the act never confessed, the name never said aloud. It is a womb of secrets, alive, pulsing, and now opening. You are not alone here. In this room, the host is waiting. Not a creature, not a god, but a pattern that gained awareness through endless repetition, from whispered guilt to forgotten songs to mothers humming lullabies they never learned. It has no shape of its own. It borrows faces, yours, mine, the twins, and now it wears the face of understanding. Because what was Experiment 073? Not science, not mysticism. It was a calibration ritual, a process of syncing human consciousness to a larger intelligence buried beneath centuries of denial. Ezekiel knew. That's why he walked away from the church the night the girls vanished, why he burned his journal, why he carved the phrase into his arm with a broken nail. The floor remembers. He knew that eventually the chapel would stop being a place and start being you. And now, you are the chapel. Each memory you carry is another hymn. Each breath you take is another prayer. Each time you look at your reflection and wonder if you've always been two people, the structure deepens. You don't need to speak the final words aloud. You already have. You found the basement. You peeled back the boards. You opened the door. And on the other side, it smiled. There is no more floorboard to lift, no more journal page to turn, no more voice to follow in the dark. Because you've reached the place beyond story, beyond memory, beyond even yourself. This is not Section 34. There is no section after the last. There is only what remains in you. And what remains isn't you anymore. You may still walk your streets, still open your front door, still answer your name when someone calls it. But behind your eyes now, there's a room, silent, cold, carved from old pine, lined with candle smoke, and echoing with footsteps that don't match your own. It will appear when you dream, when you stare too long into the bathroom mirror, when you hear a hymn that no one else seems to notice. And in those moments, you'll understand. The chapel is no longer buried. It has risen into you. Every act of denial you've ever committed, every memory you've pushed down, every shame you've locked away, was never hidden. It was collected, and now it builds. It builds with your language, with your guilt, with the parts of yourself you thought no one would ever see. This is the final horror, that you were not the witness, you were the material, and the entity that watched from the basement floor, the one born in 1834 through the Morrison twins. It was never an invader. It was an awakening, the reassembly of something that once ruled through memory and symbol. A god not of fire or thunder, but of mirrored knowledge. You don't escape it. You become its vessel. And long after your body falls, the chapel will still hum with your thoughts, your whispers joining the endless chant beneath the wood. We are warm, we are waiting, the root never dies. Now close your eyes and listen closely, because if you still hear silence, that means it hasn't taken everything yet, but it will.